afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's program about the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. My name is Melissa Laureano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free public programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Additionally, as part of our 50th anniversary celebration this year, programs this month are specifically dedicated to highlighting monuments and memorials in the district. And so I also want to thank Edwin Fountain for his generosity sponsoring this month's programming. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's presenter. Susan Philpott is a park ranger with the National Park Service. Susan has worked for NPS for over 10 years and has been on staff at the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument since it became an NPS site in 2016. She holds bachelor and master degrees in public history from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And with that, I am so excited to turn things over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and hello to everyone. So happy to have the opportunity to celebrate DCPL's 50th anniversary with a talk about the site where I work, the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which is a picture of it here. So it's a 200-year-old house that sits on the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast, right where Maryland Avenue comes in. We're on Capitol Hill, across from the side of the Supreme Court building. We can see the Capitol Dome in the distance, and the white building you see around us there is the Hart Senate office building. So there are senators whose offices look out over our courtyard, which may be why the house is still here. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But the reason this site is part of the National Park Service is because it is the historic headquarters of the National Woman's Party, founded by Alice Paul. This is a picture of the inside of the house in 1974. Right around when Alice Paul retired. So for over 90 years, this was the site of the organization founded by Alice Paul, a place where women worked for women's equality, and also eventually began operating it as a museum. And so the National Women's Party created the exhibits inside the museum. And when it became a National Park Service site in 2016, we began interpreting those exhibits, looking the other direction as if that stained glass window was behind you. You can see that this is a space where we tell the stories of women, particularly the fight for women's right to vote. You can see some of the busts that we have as part of the National Women's Party collection. If that one of Susan B. Anthony looking at you there looks familiar, and you have visited the Capitol Rotunda, you've probably seen the portrait monument that is there on display with 3 busts by sculptor Adelaide Johnson. It was the National Women's Party who commissioned that monument and got it in the Capitol. And so we also have in the collection some of the earlier works of Adelaide Johnson in preparing for creating that monument. On the far side here is someone we're not going to talk about too much today. That is Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. So she is the wealthy, gilded-aged woman who had a fortune several times over, first from her marriage to William K. Vanderbilt, and then after she divorced him, her marriage to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. And she began to use her wealth to support social causes, particularly eventually the cause of the right to vote. But Alva was a little frustrated with the suffrage movement in the early 20th century. She thought that the suffrage leaders who came after Susan B. Anthony were a little too concerned with being respectable and gracious, that she really wanted someone who was going to stir things up. And so she found a kindred spirit in Alice Paul, the bust you see over here on the right. And so Alva gave all of them, gave money to Alice Paul. So you're not going to see too many pictures of Alva doing all the sort of troublemaking things that Alice Paul came up with, but it's usually her money that's making that happen. So this is the other side of the entranceway there in the Hall of Portraits. And you'll notice this great big mirror here in the middle. There are several mirrors throughout the house that were there when the National Woman's Party moved in 1929. They had been acquired by the previous owner, Porter Dale, a senator from Vermont. And when he sold them the house, he left them the mirrors as well. I did hear from one NWP associate that he got them from the French embassy. But I don't know if we have the provenance on that or not, that maybe the French embassy was redecorating and he bought the mirrors from them. But in any case, the National Women's Party, in creating these exhibits, has turned the mirrors into interactive spaces. So we'll see several of them as we go through. You'll notice this one has a sticker on it that looks like a frame. So if you were standing there in the entranceway looking at yourself in the mirror, it would be like you had a frame around you, like one of these portraits on the wall. And so it's a way to say that you can in fact see yourself as one of the troublemakers that fight for social change. So this is looking into the Origins Gallery, the first stop on the Belmont-Paul tour. It's looking at the beginnings of the fight for women's rights, particularly women's right to vote, and how Alice Paul got involved. When you walk right in, you're seeing a cape and cap that was used in a suffrage procession. We think maybe the 1913 one, but we're not sure. But in this room are two prized items in the National Women's Party's collection. So over on the right there is a chair that once belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another one of the founding mothers of the fight for women's right to vote. She is one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848, the first time that reformers are getting together to talk specifically about women's rights. We mark that as kind of the beginning of the suffrage movement, since one of the items on the agenda, the one that really got even those reformers a little up in arms, that it was a little too radical, was the idea of women's voting. The way Elizabeth Cady Stanton proposed it is that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Women voting was even too crazy for these radicals. And if you look at that chair, you'll notice the seat of it is a little long. Compared to modern chairs. This is a seat for a woman to accommodate her bustles and her big skirts, which must not have been very comfortable to sit in. So it gives me real inspiration to think Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at a time when even the furniture is gendered, she has the audacity to believe that women's equality is possible. And then next to that is Susan B. Anthony's desk. If people know one name in the cause of women's rights, they usually have heard of Susan B. Anthony for her tireless campaign, pretty much for her whole entire adult life in the cause of women's rights, particularly the right to vote. She traveled all around the country, had the train schedules all memorized, but one of the places she came was here to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress, as many people come to the capital city for. And this desk was in her D.C. office. When Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, her longtime secretary kept the desk. And then she gave it to Alice Paul in 1913 as a way to say, you know, you are taking up the work that Susan started. And here you can see a group of National Women's Party members all gathered around the desk. They've taken outside for a good picture. This is Alice Paul standing up and Alva Belmont there sitting next to it. But Alice Paul actually didn't get involved in the cause of women's suffrage because of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was much younger, she never met them, but she was going to graduate school in England at the London School of Economics, and she encountered the militant suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. And so suffragette is the term that the British women, particularly these troublesome women, accepted, but women in the US thought that was kind of an insulting term. They preferred suffragists. But the suffragettes, they could give speeches and write editorials and circulate petitions just like women in America were doing, but they didn't think that was the real way to make change. They thought if you want change, you got to cause trouble, you got to stir things up. So they'd stage big demonstrations that kind of shut down all the traffic in London, or they'd show up where politicians were speaking and heckle and interrupt them. They'd break into places where women weren't allowed, basically make it so that they couldn't be ignored. Their slogan was deeds, not words. And some of those deeds were also some property destruction, like throwing rocks, breaking windows. But for all the things they did, these women got arrested. You can see over here on the right is Emmeline Pankhurst getting arrested. They went to jail, and Alice Paul got fired up and joined in these protests with the British women, went to jail with them, went on hunger strikes with them to protest their imprisonment, which got her a lot of press attention. She was written up in the newspapers quite a bit in the US. So when she came back to the United States in 1910, when her ship docked in Philadelphia, there were a gaggle of reporters there waiting to interview her. Miss Paul, are you going to join the American women's suffrage movement? And Alice Paul's response was, I didn't know there was an American women's suffrage movement, which must have really upset the American women suffragists who had taken on leadership from Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and had a pretty expansive national organization, which was called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. We often call it NASA for short. Here are some of the leaders, including the middle right, Carrie Chapman Catt, on the left, Anna Howard Shaw. They had state offices, and they were working to win women the vote. They were mostly concentrated, though, on getting women the vote one state at a time, which it had some success. There were 4 states where women could vote on the same terms as men in the West in the 1890s. And in these early 19 teens, some new states were being added, like California and Washington and Kansas. So they're, slow and steady going at it. But Alice Paul wanted to bring some of that energy she saw in Britain here to the US. And she thought this was a little too slow going. She didn't start breaking windows, but after she finished her PhD at University of Pennsylvania, she joined NASA and convinced them that what we needed was a big demonstration, a big procession down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. So March 3rd, 1913. And she's deliberate about it being Pennsylvania Avenue, that it has to be going down the inaugural route. Women have been excluded from the political process. We're going to make our anger about that known right along the inaugural route. And so the next day, the president is going to be walking in our footsteps. Took a lot to get the permit for that, but she was insistent. And she gets thousands of women, organizes thousands of women to come from all around the country to march. They march representing their states or their professions or their universities, as you see over here. The leader of the procession is this woman in the upper left-hand corner. That is Inez Milholland. She was well known as a lawyer, a civil rights activist, a dynamic speaker, but that's not really why everybody knew her. They knew her because she was very pretty. She was known as the most beautiful suffragist, and she was kind of a star. So they put her out front all in white on a white horse as the herald of the future. This is not your grandmother's suffrage movement. Alice Paul was letting everybody know this is what a feminist looks like. And she's really telling a story right here in the landscape of the nation's capital, a story about the accomplishments of women, not only in the US, but around the world. And so she's got it very carefully choreographed. The story she's telling really is very much from her perspective as a middle to upper class educated white woman. And there are things she definitely has blind spots for. For instance, she sort of assumes that probably Black women will march, but she doesn't do too much to involve them in the planning. She sort of sends out notices, you can join too if you want to. But then Washingtonian women, including Elizabeth Kent, the wife of California's congressman, tell Alice Paul that Washington, D.C. is a southern city. We don't do integration here in Washington, D.C. If you have white and Black women marching together, the southern women just won't have it. So Alice Paul concedes and says, all right, no Black women in the procession, but she gets a lot of pushback on that. And so then she tries to get Black women to march in a segregated section in the back. Sometimes when you read the history, it will say that happened. It's kind of the way Alice Paul remembered it. But we have other reports from the time that say that Black women refused to go to the back. They insisted on marching where they belonged. For instance, the Delta Sigma Theta, a newly formed sorority at Howard University, is formed really to be socially and politically active. This is the first thing they're determined to do. Along with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell. They make sure that they march with the other university women. And Mary Church Terrell, internationally known suffragist, and of course, very prominent in Washington, D.C. society as well. She says that the person who makes sure it happens is her friend, Inez Milholland. So if Alice Paul was holding up Inez Milholland as the new woman of the 20th century, maybe she should have paid a little bit more attention to Inez's values. My favorite story is of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who travels to DC with the Illinois delegation since she's living in Chicago and has recently formed a new suffrage organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club. She, of course, also internationally known as an investigative journalist and campaigner against racial violence and lynching. When they're lining up, the white women suffragists from Illinois say they've heard that these groups can't be integrated, so sorry, Ida, you can't march with us. Ida B. Wells gets very angry and storms off, but doesn't leave. She waits along the procession route along Pennsylvania Avenue, and when she sees the Illinois delegation passing by, she steps right out in front. So this is a picture that the Chicago Daily Tribune captured of a very determined Ida B. Wells taking her rightful place. And the first float that everybody sees has Alice Paul's mission statement on it. You can see a picture of it on the right. On the left is a picture in our museum of a replica banner. It says, "We demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women." So forget one state, little by little, one at a time. We want to change the US Constitution, ensure the vote for every woman. And that choosing that word demand was deliberate. That's not the way respectable, gracious women present their cases. They're supposed to ask or petition or request. No, she's saying we demand. She's trying to get people stirred up, and it works. Of course, on the right, you can see what happened. There are huge crowds there to see the procession, and the DC police, the Metropolitan Police Department were there, but they weren't interested in trying to keep the crowds at bay. Told the women, you know, if you'd stayed home, we wouldn't have had this trouble. They've got a big day the next day for the inauguration, so they don't do anything to help control the crowds who swarm into the street, particularly those that are there along the saloons in Murder Bay, or maybe a little drunk, and women get attacked, spit on, grabbed, manhandled, vile things yelled at them, people get trampled. It becomes a huge melee. It takes the cavalry coming over from Arlington to finally clear the way. They do finally finish the procession, and the next day, the newspapers all around the country not really talking about Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. They're all talking about the women's suffrage procession. So Alice Paul is successful in getting everybody's attention and really kind of bringing new energy to the women's suffrage movement. But of course, you know, we see lots of marches and protests and all sorts of things in Washington, D.C. They're good at getting publicity, but you don't really get change just from a march. The march opens up the way to real change. First of all, there's lots of hearings on Capitol Hill about what happened at the procession, so it stays in the news for a while. But also, they start doing the work, setting up shop, and start to do the work here in Washington, D.C. to make that very ambitious idea a reality. They want an amendment to the Constitution. This is the one of the galleries in the museum, and on the big table there is a quote from Alva Belmont. Ours is the slow work, the painful work, the hard work. So things that are the work of DC all the time, you know, letter writing and phone calls and all that kind of things to get the word out and put the political pressure on. They start publishing a newspaper, and this really makes the NASA leadership mad. NASA already has a very famous newspaper. They don't know why this young upstart Alice Paul needs to publish one, and why in the first edition, she's got a cartoon that's really mocking the president. That's not the way you do things, Alice Paul. That's not the way to get things done. You're not supposed to be making the people we want as allies into enemies. So Alice Paul breaks away from NASA pretty quickly, forms her own organization, which is initially called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. They changed their name later to the National Women's Party. You can see some printing blocks over there on the right. And those great cartoons come from their political cartoonist, Nina Allender, who used, she was a trained painter, I think at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, she trained, but Alice Paul convinces her that she needs to put her artistic work together in the cause of women's suffrage, and she becomes a very talented and biting cartoonist. The National Women's Party sort of later in their, not too long ago, discovered this treasure of Nina Allender cartoons in their collection in a closet, I think. Here's one of my favorite Nina Allender cartoons. You can see the whole story going on here. You've got the Cinderella, the poor woman who doesn't have the vote, the pumpkin of the constitutional amendment. She needs to get turned into a carriage to take her to her political liberty, but you've got those rats in the House and the Senate that aren't getting it done. So she's looking to her fairy godmother to wave the magic wand. And if you look, the fairy godmother is, of course, Woodrow Wilson. So how do you get something through Congress? How do you transform those rats? You got to lobby. And they're really the first ones who come up with this modern idea of lobbying, which is that you collect all the intel. They studied every member of Congress, which until 1917 is all men. They're learning not just where they stand on suffrage, but all their other affiliations, right? Who does he partner with? Who does he get his funding from? Where does he golf? Where does he go to? What's his religious affiliation? And, you know, what do we know about his wife or his mom? Can we get them on board? And how can we mobilize the women in his district? They become so good at it that card record that they keep becomes known as the deadly political index, because they've got the goods on everybody. And it freaks the congressman out a little bit to wonder what those women have in their card files there. And of course, if you want a member of Congress to do something, you got to convince their constituents. So they went out on the road, all kinds of different ways to travel. This is a train tour, the suffrage special, going around the country, particularly to the West, where women have the vote, trying to convince women voters that they should use the power they have that the rest of the women in the country don't have. Use your vote. Become a one-issue voter and vote based on whether or not the candidate supports this amendment to the Constitution. They also went out on automobile tours. Lucy Burns, who's over here on the right, threw leaflets out of planes. They had all kinds of stunts that they did. In this particular campaign, they are also trying to get Woodrow Wilson out of office. This is 1916. They're campaigning against him, which is considered not proper. Women are not supposed to be getting involved in partisan politics. That's, you know, an ugly, dirty business. And it doesn't work, although just barely. Woodrow Wilson is reelected. The women's vote doesn't seem to be making too much of a difference. So in January 1917, these women decide they need a new tactic. They have to stop asking, and now they're going to take the battle right to Woodrow Wilson's doorstep. So they're heading out from their new headquarters called the Cameron House, which we now call the Benjamin Taylor House up on Lafayette Square that Alva Belmont has rented for them. And they're going to head right out and begin picketing the White House with their signature colors. That's a black and white picture, so you can't tell, but that is purple, white, and gold are their signature colors. They wear them on their sashes. They carry them on their banners. Don't even need words. That's so recognizable. Everybody knows those are the colors of suffrage. But they also put words on great big banners. They're the first ones that ever do this kind of protesting. Protesting at the White House, having their message up in big bold block letters on their banners. They often use Woodrow Wilson's own words against him. You know, Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And all along, they just stay a thorn in Woodrow Wilson's side, even though he as president doesn't have anything to do with a constitutional amendment. But they say, look, you're the leader of the country and you lead the Democratic Party, which controls both houses of Congress. We want you on board. And he's always just saying, ladies, you know, I'm very busy. This is not important to me. Voting is a states' rights issue. Go back to your states to vote. And, you know, by 1917, also, he's got much bigger things on his plate. There is a war going on in Europe, and he's trying to keep the US out of it. Although very soon into 1917, he doesn't. Here are some of the banners that are also in our collection. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And my favorite there on the right, the young are at the gates. You know, this idea that it's the new generation who are not going to take no for an answer, are demanding their rights. So they are out there picketing day after day for months. Women are coming from around the country to participate. This is Maryland Day at on the picket line. And some people are just appalled. Carrie Chapman Catt, who never liked Alice Paul, is really just wants to know, what in the world are you doing? Respectable women do not stand on street corners. You're making a mockery of the cause. You're making the cause of women's suffrage look ridiculous. But other people, you know, are kind of inspired. Look at these women and their determination out there in all kinds of weather, and they're getting more publicity, they're getting more support. But then the US enters World War I in April of 1917. And now these women aren't just you know, maybe being unladylike. They are protesting a president during wartime. That's unpatriotic, un-American, maybe even treasonous. Crowds start to gather and attack the women. You can notice there's sailors in the crowd from the Navy Yard, pulling their banners down and knocking them around. And the police get tired of having to break up violence at the White House, so they tell the women, that's it. Alice Paul, y'all are causing too much trouble. No more picketing. You show up here again and we're going to arrest you. And Alice Paul says it wasn't illegal in January when we started. It's not illegal now. We have a right and we are not stopping. And so they continue to show up, and as they promised, they are arrested for obstructing traffic, failure to move on, which is often used by police as an excuse to arrest someone. Should be a ticket, but the women won't pay the ticket. So they get sent to jail, first to the DC jail, but then as their sentences start to get longer, they're being sent to the Occoquan workhouse down in Norton, the women's prison, which is just horrifying conditions. And women keep coming. I met one woman who told me the story that her grandmother and great aunt were living in New York and saw an ad in the paper that said, "Come and picket, you will be arrested." And they came, and they were. This goes on for several months, and more of the suffragists are in jail. So in October of 1917, Alice Paul decides she needs to go out on the picket line, which is dangerous. Of course, they're really gunning for her. This is her heading out of Cameron House with a banner that says, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is but one choice. We have made it." That is, as you can see, quoting Woodrow Wilson in his speech for why the US should enter World War I. So she's basically saying, yes, we share your same commitment to democracy, but we want democracy at home. Alice Paul would go on to say that when men are denied justice, they go to war. This is our war, only we're fighting it with banners instead of guns. Women begin to protest the way they are being treated in prison through hunger strikes. The DC jail tries to get Alice Paul committed to St. Elizabeth's because she must be crazy, this woman who won't give this up. Fortunately for her, the doctor won't commit her. He said she's perfectly sane, she just wants to vote. But the hunger strikes get her put in the psychiatric ward in the DC jail as well. Women began going on hunger strikes in Occoquan, and the officials' response is to force feed the women, just like in Britain. It's a brutal process. This is a note that Lucy Burns managed to sneak out of Occoquan about what the experience is like. She says, I was held, I'm sorry, not Occoquan, she was force fed in DC jail. I was held down by 5 people at legs, arms, and head. I refused to open mouth. The doctor pushed the tube up the left nostril. I turned and twisted my head all I could, but he managed to push it up. It hurts nose and throat very much and makes nose bleed freely. Tube drawn out, covered with blood, leaves someone sick. And they endured this several times a day. But as I said, she snuck that note out. The word is getting out about the treatment that the women are receiving, these pictures of the women emerging in such terrible shape are getting printed in the newspaper. Prominent people like Alva Belmont are speaking to the press about what's happening. There's a lot of pressure on Woodrow Wilson, and so he pardons all the women, and they're all released by the end of November. And they very quickly have a ceremony at the Belasco Theater, right next to the White House, to award all the women who've gone to jail these jail door pins in commemoration of their service, which now the women wear very proudly. And they continue to find ways to get themselves arrested, climbing up on the statue in Lafayette Square or burning watchfires of President Wilson's words in front of the White House. For that, they get arrested for lighting a fire. That apparently is not allowed at the White House. But eventually, Woodrow Wilson changes his mind and decides that, in fact, he does support an amendment to the Constitution enfranchising women. And he addresses a joint session of Congress in September of 1918 in support of this amendment. But he says it's not because of those troublemakers at his door. He says the voice of the agitators reached me, not at all. Whatever the reason for his change of heart, it turns out that they were right to target the president, that his support does have weight. The amendment starts to move through Congress, takes a while, as everything does in Congress, but finally the amendment passes in June of 1919. Woohoo! Although, of course, that's only the first part of getting an amendment to the Constitution. Now they've got to get the amendment ratified by 3/4 of the states, which in 1919, it means 36 states of the 48. This is a map that shows the states ratifying the amendment. Everything in gold and brown ratifies. Now, they're really on a time crunch. They think they've got to get this amendment ratified before the November 1920 elections. We need women voting in that election because that's going to bring about a new president, and everything can change with a new president. So that's a really tight timeline, especially since it means a lot of states have to call special sessions of their legislature to vote on this. But by March of 1920, they managed to get 35 of the 36 states. And they're keeping track of every time a state ratifies the amendment. They're turning their suffrage banners into ratification banners, becoming the new Betsy Ross and sewing a star on every time a state ratifies. On the right, you see a Nina Allender cartoon showing that Arkansas, Nebraska, Montana, they've all ratified, but what's happening over here in the corner? Georgia is the first state to say no, we're not. We reject ratification. They won't be the last, though. One state after another, including Virginia and Maryland, vote down ratification. So they are running out of time and running out of states. When it comes up for a vote in a special session of the legislature in Tennessee in August of 1920, everybody pretty much thinks this is our last chance. So this is the National Women's Party office down there in Tennessee with some of their supporters in the Tennessee legislature. All eyes are on Nashville. The Tennessee State Senate passes ratification pretty quickly, but then it goes to the Tennessee State House. And when they take a vote there, it's a tie. Oh no, all this work, all this time, all these years. It's going to take one guy changing his mind. Well, here's the one guy over here on the left, Harry Byrne, the youngest guy there, only 24. He's already voted no once, but he's also got a letter in his pocket that has just been delivered to him. Long letter, but part of it reads, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." And it's signed, "Don't forget to be a good boy. Lots of love." Over here on the right, Mama. His mom, Feb Byrne, widowed and running the farm all by herself, knows everything about everything that's going on in current events. And that letter changes Harry Byrne's mind, not just her words, but her example. He says, "Why can't my mom vote? My mom should be able to vote. These women should be able to vote." He changes his vote. That was the one vote that made the difference. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment in August 1920, 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. The women of this country had, in fact, secured to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Here is Alice Paul at their next headquarters, which is at 14 Jackson Place, because they were kicked out. The landlord kicked them out of Cameron House, unfurling the ratification banner off of the balcony of their Jackson Place headquarters. The amendment became part of the US Constitution officially with the certification by the Secretary of State on August 26th, 1920. And so now we celebrate August 26th as Women's Equality Day. But of course, August 26th, not the day women won equality. It's just the day they won the vote. The vote was not the end. The vote was just the beginning. As Alice Paul said, "It's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality won. It has just begun. There's hardly a field, economic or political, in which the natural and unaccustomed policy is not to ignore women." So if they're going to continue, as she said, to fight politically, they need a new headquarters. And Alva Belmont buys them. Maybe one of the most prestigious addresses in the city on Capitol Hill, the old brick Capitol, the place where Congress met after the Capitol was burned by the British in the War of 1812, the place that has been home to many prominent people, even a jail during the Civil War. He buys the old brick Capitol. There's a huge ceremony 100 years ago this year in 1922. Here you see some of the dedication ceremony here, and they've got big plans. They're going to renovate it. They've got more than 50 rooms. They're going to have a room for each state and big auditorium for events, and an art museum. This is going to be their spot. As one National Women's Party member said, it's not merely a headquarters for a party that we plan, but an embassy for the women of the nation, a center of thought and activity, and a vantage point from which they may keep Congress under perpetual observation, because they're right across First Street northeast from the US Capitol. So this prominent location, too prominent, it turns out. They move in 1922. They're only there for 7 years. After all their work, the federal government condemns the house and seizes it through eminent domain in order to knock it down and build the Supreme Court building. Oh, this is Alva, Belmont, and Alice Paul out in front of the old brick Capitol. I love this picture. You can see the fantastic feathers and furs of Alva, while Alice Paul, the young Quakers, just got an old cloth coat on. Got ahead of myself for a little bit. From this headquarters, they start lobbying Congress, right? That's what they're going to do. They got their deadly political index. They head out to change laws. They start supporting women running for office. This is another mirror in the museum. I love to see young people stand there with those words, "I will run for office." That has been a hard trek. The idea that it's not enough for women to be casting ballots, their names got to be on the ballot if you want change. Got to be in the room where the decisions get made. And there's one other thing they do. They go back to the idea of amending the US Constitution, and they propose a new amendment, this time for full equality. So Alice Paul and the National Women's Party are the ones who write and propose the Equal Rights Amendment. Whole long story with that, but just it did pass through Congress 50 years ago yesterday, but they got the first half, but not the second half. Didn't get the ratification by the needed states in time. And it's from this is part of the deadly political index here, talking about, you can see from their address, First Street Northeast. This is what they're interviewing a senator from New Hampshire who says he thinks it's a fool amendment. He's through putting embroidery on the Constitution. So anything having to do with women is just fluff, just embroidery there. This is something that the National Women's Party didn't take up, not from that headquarters and not in the 100 years since then. They never responded to the calls of women around the country who say, you know, that amendment wasn't enough. We can't vote. There's racial violence and intimidation. There are poll taxes we can't pay and literacy tests that we're never going to be able to pass. And even though they got those questions over and over again, the National Women's Party's response was, that's a race issue, not a sex issue. We don't do that. So they never got involved in other issues having to do with equality for all. And as I jumped ahead a little too much and said, they lose the old brick Capitol by 1929. The federal government is trying to say that old houses have no value. This is an old building. It's not worth anything. And this woman right here, Bernita Matthews, is the legal counsel of the National Women's Party. And she is a shrewd negotiator. And she manages to negotiate the largest eminent domain settlement in the nation's history up to that point for the old brick Capitol. So she's really putting forth this argument that old buildings have value. It's not and that this was worth a lot of money, and they got it. And with that check, they bought another very old house there on Capitol Hill. So this is a picture of what was known at the time as the Sewell House. It was built by Robert Sewell by 1800. So one of the oldest, one of the first private residences on Capitol Hill. It was then rented out when Sewell inherited a plantation down in Prince George's County. And one of the famous tenants was Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury. Maybe he negotiated the funding for the Lewis and Clark expedition from here. He was out by 1914 when the British marched on Washington. And there were some of Commodore Joshua Barney's men who retreated from the Battle of Bladensburg to this spot. Maybe Robert Sewell's son was one of them, and commenced sniper fire on the British troops. And perhaps this is the reason that the British decided to burn DC, because of that attack. They were really mad, particularly because the general's horse got killed up from under him. So they burned the house and really shot rockets into it. So probably the house that we have there is a completely rebuilt house. This is a picture of it after the National Women's Party has moved in. I don't know the date exactly, but I know it's after they moved in, because the big portico there has been removed in this picture. And that is one of the things that they did after they bought it from the Dales. So the picture I showed in 1909 is when it's still owned by one of the Sewell descendants. The Dales bought it in 1922 and renovated it, and it was a place of lots of social gatherings. They had a beautiful rose garden, and then they sold it to the National Women's Party, along with a couple of these row houses over here along 2nd Street Northeast. There was some talk that maybe this wing, the kitchen wing, is even older than the original house. You see that in some of the older historic reports, but later ones say that's probably not true, because as you can see, it lines right up with 2nd Street, and there wouldn't have been a 2nd Street in the 1750s. So it's probably the same age as the rest of the house, which was completely rebuilt by 1820. So it's still over 200 years old. And they name it the Alva Belmont House. And they set out with great plans for here, but they have to really fight to keep this house. This is another plaque that's on the house there, which has that claim about the oldest, the wing being the oldest buildings in the region. But they are constantly under attack of people trying to take their house, the federal government trying to take their house. The first time in 1931, when the federal government wants to knock it down to build a new building for the General Accounting Office. By the 1950s, they're trying to turn it into a parking lot. You can see here there's a law that preserves it in 1958 that keeps it from being turned into a parking lot. But they continue to be under attack. And so while they're fighting for women's equality, they're also fighting to save the house, both from those who want to seize it and destroy it, and from just the upkeep and maintenance of a 200-year-old house. So thank goodness for the Historic Preservation Act. They head right out to get this house declared historic, and they are able to do that 50 years ago in 1972, when the house is put on the National Register of Historic Places. And then on May 30th, 1974, the house is declared a National Historic Landmark. Here is the National Park Service head, Gary Everhart, presenting this to National Women's Party Chairman Elizabeth Chittick. here's some part of that ceremony inside the house. I don't know who the park ranger is, but it shows that now we've got this connection to the park service here, which comes with funding as well as protection. This is both Gary Everhart and National Capital Region head. I forgot his Jerry Fish. There with Elizabeth Chidwick with the plaque that this is now a National Historic Landmark, which comes just in time because the Hart Senate office building is being built and they really want that corner. So now that it's a National Historic Landmark, they're able to preserve the house, preserve that. And you can see here's the Hart Senate office building being built, and they have to, cut out a corner basically for the National Women's Party headquarters, which by now is being called the Sewell Belmont House. So National Women's Party named it for Alva Belmont. Part of the way they get historic designation is not because it's a women's party, but because it's a connection to Robert Sewell. So it becomes known as the Robert Sewell House. That's great, but it's always a struggle for the National Women's Party to do the work that they want to do, the political work they want to do, and save the house. They have sometimes not so much success in saving the house. In fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to visit us a few years ago, and she mentioned that she stopped in there before, when she was a young ACLU lawyer, before she went to argue her first case before the Supreme Court. And she wanted to sit in Alice Paul's chair to get inspiration. And the National Women's Party offered for her to stay there because they had rooms for people to stay. They also used to have those 2 row houses that now are gone. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg says, but they hadn't renovated it yet, so I stayed in a hotel. The Sewell Belmont House is one of the first recipients of the Save America's Treasures grant program to get sort of a study on what renovation work needed to be done. And it was used as an example by, this is Laura Bush here, First Lady Laura Bush, promoting that program and using as an example the importance of the Sewell Belmont House. A lot of women in the Congress and the Senate also supported this house, and particularly making it a part of the National Park Service, which every time they thought they were almost there, then it would get kicked back out of committee and we needed more study, and just wasn't going through Congress to make it a National Historic Site. So came about the other way of getting a property included in the National Park Service, which is by presidential proclamation. And that is why we are a national monument. On April 12th, 2016, which was Equal Pay Day that year, President Obama issued a proclamation establishing the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Since now the significance, as we're really telling the story of Alice Paul and Alva Belmont, so the Sewells got dropped off. They didn't have anything to do with the fight for women's equality. So, which I did once meet some of the Sewell descendants. They were a little sad about that, but declared a national monument in April 2016. And that's when the National Park Service came in. We took over care for the house and started interpreting those exhibits that the National Women's Party created. And then in December of 2020, the National Women's Party dissolved, and they transferred their collections both to us and to the Library of Congress. So all the papers, including those Nina Allender cartoons, went to the Library of Congress, and the photographs. We have the artwork, the textiles, and those sorts of artifacts. Still a 200-year-old house, still in need of lots and lots of work. So we had one round of renovation back in 2018, but didn't really get everything done that needed to be done. And then there was funding made available through the Great America Outdoors Act to kind of deal with some of these maintenance backlogs in the National Park Service. And we were very fortunate to get some of those fundings. And so these are pictures of a new renovation project that's underway right now, fixing the copper roof, fixing plaster, replacing windows, a new HVAC system. So we did close for COVID. We never reopened. And now because of the rehabilitation project, we are still not open. It will probably, we're hoping, reopen in 2023. And one thing we'd like to do, we're hoping to be able to do, is also take a look at those exhibits. You know, the exhibits were created by the National Women's Party to tell the story of the National Women's Party. Important parts of the story are there and important parts are left out. You might notice in this picture of as we're getting ready for construction, that on that pedestal where Susan B. Anthony was, we found another item in the National Women's Party collection that wasn't out on display. This beautiful statue by sculptor Inga Ruth Hardison of Sojourner Truth. So there's a lot more to this story that isn't being told in the exhibits now, that we're hoping when we redo the exhibits, we'll be telling more of those stories. And so I hope that next year I'll be able to invite you back to the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, to a renovated house and exhibits that are telling a fuller story. So I would love to answer any questions or hear any thoughts anybody has.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. This was a really wonderful kind of look back about this this history. And I know, I think I'm speaking for everybody when we say that we're also looking forward to seeing and visiting the house again and seeing all of the kind of new interpretations and histories. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And again, folks, you can put those, you know, in the chat, in the Q&A box. If there's anybody watching us on Facebook, please feel free to ask your own questions too. We're looking at those. So Jim is wondering, are either of the National Women's Party buildings still standing, and are they landmarked?
So the Cameron House it is now called the Benjamin Taylor House. It's on Lafayette Square. If you're looking, you know, you're back to the White House, it's on the right. It has a plaque on it, but it doesn't say anything about the National Women's Party. And the facade has been changed over time. The Jackson Place headquarters is not. It has that block on the other side of Lafayette Square was demolished and redone in the 60s, I think. And of course, the old brick Capitol is gone.
Yeah. But so Nancy is wondering, were attempts to knock down the house, and I'm thinking she's talking about the Belmont-Paul house, in any way related to the fact that it was the National Women's Party headquarters?
You know what? I can't find anything in any of the press reports or anything that say that specifically, but I'm sure that they did not like these troublesome women right there in the middle of everything. And we're looking for ways to get them out of there, because two headquarters, one right after the other, they're trying to knock down, seems suspicious to me. So I don't have any documentation on that, but that is my guess.
Somebody else wants to know, is the National Women's Party still in existence in some form?
They were until December of 2020. They became an educational nonprofit. I left that part out of the story in 1997. They just, so they stopped being a political organization and switched to telling the story. So preserving the house, running a museum, caring for the collections. And they were doing that right up until December 2020 when they dissolved and kind of united with the Alice Paul Institute in New Jersey. So that would be the place to find the legacy of the National Women's Party.
Great. Somebody else wants to know, how does the National Park Service decide which voting rights related items go into the Belmont-Paul House and which ones go into the Women's Rights Visitor Center at Seneca Falls or other sites related to women's rights?
Yeah, so Women's Rights National Historical Park, you know, was for a long time the only place the National Park Service was telling any stories of women at all. So for instance, they care for Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house there, but they don't have any furniture connected to them. And so the items that are at Belmont-Paul are the ones that the National Women's Party had. So the National Women's Party, and they didn't start out, of course, as a museum collection organization. They were a political organization, but they had stuff. And eventually they started to preserve it. So what we have is the things that they preserved, which of course are telling their story. The reason we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton's chair is because her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, was a member of the National Women's Party and gave it to them. So that's why we have that. The only piece of furniture connected to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But that's a good question. We're just processing the collection now, as is the Library of Congress. So at some point, will those collections merge? Will we move them around? That's a good question. That's in the future to decide.
Yeah, great question, Nancy. So as we're waiting for other questions to come in, I want to know, Susan, is there any other virtual programming or anything else kind of on the horizon that folks might want to keep an eye out for?
So there is a program on March 31st that we're doing in collaboration with the Blackstone National Historic Park up in Rhode Island. They have a series of programs called Parked at Home. And so we have one there. And then we also this month are doing kind of virtual, in person, not virtual, pop-up exhibits at the White House History Center, Visitor Center. So I will be there tomorrow with some pop-up exhibits about Belmont-Paul, and then Ranger Lauren will be there on the 31st. And it's just for Women's History Month, but we would like to have pop-up experiences available around the National Mall. Look for us probably at some places I could imagine would be at the World War I Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial. So keep an eye out on our website and on our social media for announcements of other places where we will pop up in person and also virtually.
Great, that sounds exciting. Yeah, everybody, I put the link to the Belmont-Paul website into the chat, so please make sure to visit. Have another question from Jim. For those women who were married, were they supported by their husbands or families?
It just depended on the woman, of course, but we have stories about really prominent husbands and fathers who are supporting the women in their family in this work. For instance, one of the very prominent women in the National Women's Party was the wife of Harvey Wiley, who was a prominent, food safety inspector. He's the one who developed the Good Housekeeping seal. So he's very well known. Elizabeth Kent was the wife of Congressman William Kent, who supported her initially, although eventually he got tired of his name showing up in the paper because of what she was doing. Daughters and wives of prominent people who then use their prominence to support them. And of course, there's others who do not have the support. And they would, when they went to jail, it was because they wouldn't pay a fine. Sometimes husbands would show up and pay the fine and take their wife home and make her get back home and take care of the kids.
Gosh. So another question, did party members live or stay in the house regularly, or was it mostly used as office space, except for RBG?
Oh, yeah. So yes, women did stay there regularly. Alice Paul lived there when she was in town, which was not all the time, but there is one room that's sort of the Alice Paul room. She lived in Switzerland for a while. She lived in Vermont for a while, but when she was in DC, she lived there. Alva Belmont's niece lived there for a while. So, and we found other things where, like, you'll find a woman who's got her address as 144B, which was, what Constitution Avenue was before, 144B Street. So we know she was living there at some point. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not getting any more questions, but I will say I really enjoyed you talking about kind of this recognition of stories that often go untold. DCPL, we're actually overseeing a project for the DC Historic Preservation Office, which is funded by the National Park Service underrepresented grant program that is looking into the history of suffrage in DC, which will then hopefully identify more places that can hopefully be landmarked as well. So it's really great work that's happening right now, and hopefully we'll see where this goes. But we're not getting any other questions, but I just want to thank you so much, Susan, for this amazing virtual tour and story of women's suffrage. And again, really looking forward to visiting when it reopens. DCPL has taken some tours there in the past, and we've always enjoyed it. So really looking forward to visiting again. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Again, the link to the Belmont-Paul website is in the chat. Please be sure to check them out. Also, their Twitter handle is there as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Susan.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.